Michael, thank you, and thank you all for staying the final afternoon of this great conference, and thanks again to Terrapin. Just by way of quick introduction, Morgan Lewis is a international law firm, 2,000 lawyers. We cover telecom in US, EU, Latin America, and here in Asia, including Singapore, where our partner Suet Fern Lee, the former Stanford group, heads up our Stanford Morgan Lewis Bacchius practice. I'm delighted to do this panel. I've done it before. I've been involved in over 3 dozen financing of private submarine cables, including the first private cable, Teloptic PTAT, where I remember our chairman, Ron Coleman, used to say, in terms of building the first private submarine cable, we were too dumb to know we couldn't do what we were doing. And I think what we'll see today is that we've smartened up, not me, but the industry, quite a bit in terms of private cables. So this is always a pillar of the Submarine Network World Conference, the financing panel. I think it's been on every single agenda for the last 20 years. And it's also almost a Rorschach test, a barometer of how we feel about the industry. It's like those buttons, the smiley face, the sad face buttons you see at the airport, you can press in terms of getting your feel for the pulse of the industry. And I think, thankfully, those buttons, at least for us, are trending a lot more positive. Somebody once said financing is the hardest part of the submarine cable industry, and I was going to refute that, but somebody yesterday made, I think, a very salient point, and that is if you get all the other parts of the submarine cable correct, financing becomes that much easier. And really, many of our panelists today are orchestra leaders in terms of juggling and bundling many moving pieces, moving in a very sort of complicated sequence to get all those technical, regulatory, permitting, licensing, national security issues in place to facilitate the financing. So we're really pleased today to have a very diverse panel, really from all parts of the compass, literally and figuratively. On my left is Bertrand Guillot, head of global infrastructure and projects for Asia Pacific for Natixis. Sitting next to him is Larry Schwartz, chief executive officer for Submarine Networks. Incidentally, Larry was on BBC this morning talking about his system. That's the good news. The bad news, if you're staying at the Maritime Hotel, Maritime Mandarin, they don't have BBC, so you can ask for a partial refund when you check out. Sitting next to him is Yves Ruggieri, who wears many hats, but the hat he's wearing today is chairman of the ACE Consortium, and also a man that wears many hats, Mike Cunningham, chairman of Ireland-France Subsea Cable, and last and certainly not least, Emma Vive, director of Urban Social Development, Public Management Division from the Asian Development Bank. So welcome, everybody. Let me first turn to the operators of the panel. Larry, why don't I start with you? Can you please briefly describe your network? I know you've had a number of recent milestones and the primary steps that you took to finance your network. And also, given the recent dynamic changes in the submarine cable industry, particularly in the last few years where you built your network from Brazil to the US, if you had to finance your cable system today, how at all would you change your approach? In 10 words or less.
Thank you. I have to be careful about how I would choose to change it since Bertrand from Natixis helped us with that financing. So we're very happy with how we financed it. our Seabrass 1 cable has gone live in the past month. The build was completed this past summer. It is a direct route between New York, New Jersey to Sao Paulo, Brazil. It's actually today the only direct pop-to-pop route between anywhere US and anywhere Brazil. And importantly, we're connecting the financial centers of the US and Brazil through this system. From a financing strategy, we were the first export credit agency-backed project financing of a submarine cable anywhere. Alcatel Submarine Networks did the build for us on a turnkey basis. By making it a French project, we used the French ECA, COFIS, as the export credit agency that guaranteed substantially all of our project debt for the project. The institutional equity on the project comes from Partners Group, a big Swiss publicly traded company, and the bank syndicate is led by Natixis with a few other European banks in the mix as well. So on the one hand, it was a creative financing from a submarine cable perspective, but if you look at other infrastructure asset classes outside of telecom, it was actually a very traditional approach. So developers of, say, large real estate projects or power projects would have said that that is an obvious way to finance it, but the novelty was applying that to this asset class of submarine cable.
So do you think that kind of project financing is going to repeat itself with new cables as it becomes more traditional, more copycat to other kinds of project financing?
I think it has applicability for certain routes and when in certain market conditions. I don't think it's the kind of strategy that works. There is no one solution for all routes and all projects. The reason why I say that is because with the multiple different financing parties, any export credit agency runs their own due diligence process that is like a gauntlet that's totally separate from what the bank group does, which is totally separate from the institutional equity. So there is a lot of complexity to the lead-in time, and through complexity you can infer from that as far as legal fees, diligence exercises, et cetera, that do create a certain complexity to it. On the flip side, and you do have meaningful fees that you pay up front for any export credit agency around the world. The benefit to that approach, though, is that from a debt perspective, the interest rate that we pay is a deeply discounted interest rate. So a lot of times people come to us and say, do you want to finance out of your bank debt into some publicly traded debt? And the answer is no. If you understand an ECA process, you would never consider doing that because you've already paid the fees for the privilege of getting the very low interest rate. And it's a flexible credit facility that we have. So we're very happy with the financing structure that we have. It's worked incredibly well for us on that particular project.
Great. Yves, let me turn to you in connection with your role as chair of the ACE consortium. Can you describe your network and the primary steps you took to finance it?
Yeah. Thank you, Andy. Yeah, I think ACE is also a very interesting model. ACE is a cable in Africa, right? Linking France, Portugal, Europe to South Africa, 18 landing points, 18 countries. And actually, the time between the idea and the signature of the contract was 2 years. If I say it like this, it seems impossible, right? So of course, I would say the interesting part is that if we would have thought we want a cable going from France to South Africa serving 18 countries, it would take 10 years to raise the funds. So the story was not like this. It was very different, and I think it's very interesting for the model. I think that when you want to raise up the funds, you need a good kernel, a strong, a smaller part of investors. And actually for ACE, it was a much smaller cable initiative, actually, who grows very fast. So at the origin, you had the Orange Group with the Orange subsidiaries in Africa. And the idea was just to connect the Orange subsidiaries with Africa. So it was a cable with probably 5 landings. rather easy to do, I would say, private owner and needs for the own bandwidth. But then, when we start to talk about the project, we notice that a lot of people wanted to join because they also need capacity. And bigger carriers, other than Orange, countries involved at ministry levels, and slow and slower, and quite fast actually, we had more or less the architecture of the cable with 18 landing countries. And then, of course, the financial power of the different members was very different. You have the big carriers, of course, they have money, but you have also countries, smaller carriers, countries in a monopoly state with no money and so on. So we find a way to have a mixture of private investment, the carriers, government investments, World Bank investments, European Development Bank investments. So a mix of different parties, and the model worked perfectly. For one reason, of course, there was prerequisite to some investment of the banks that the regulatory framework of some countries would change, which happened as well, because the government were very motivated to move. And it worked very, very well. We even had some, I would say, fast-track process from the World Bank, which sometimes takes very long time, right? So we are very lucky. And within 2 years, finally, everyone was agreeing about the model and the cable was launched. So the lesson from this is that sometimes the ambition should be more realistic and then you can grow, rather than having a very big idea covering the whole world, but which will never be realized, right? Because nobody will take a risk on such a big project.
Oh, that's a great contrast, thanks. Mike, you've been involved in a number of cables, and your most recent one, Ireland, France, I think is a very recent example, and I know you've spent a lot of time with bankers, since I've run into you in a number of those instances. So can you tell us how you're financing Ireland, France, and then what you've learned iteratively over your last few private cables in terms of best practices in financing?
Yeah, I think definitely the way that we've approached the financing aspect of a project has changed in a number of different respects. First off, choose those projects wisely so it's not as much of an effort. With Arctic Fiber, that was a really tough project to get financed. In addition to just being subsea cables being difficult for private developers to bring to fruition, we had the added risk of that environment. And so that was a 3-year process, went through 2 financial advisors before we could get that done. With Ireland France subsea cable, we definitely changed the approach in terms of the deal that we were marketing to institutional investors. We structured essentially the deal, and now going forward on Cross-Lake Fiber, it was the same sort of structure in that we would market an entirely equity underwritten project. So the institutional equity investors will essentially underwrite the entire capital requirement for that. And the reason for that is, there's a few different reasons, but first off, the amount of equity that you need in the business, the amount of long-term equity really can vary over the development of the project due to changes in design and in your pre-sales. So you don't necessarily know what that firm equity number is, but you need to market something that is a very firm number when you're going out to the street. And then even from a development side, it has very positive implications for the supply side of things. When you need to provide payment assurance to different vendors, now you have that payment assurance that is provided by that institutional equity investor. So while the desire isn't to go and fund the entire project with equity, that guarantee is there. And to the extent that you have the institutional equity investor has to put in more capital than they want in as long-term equity, they can go and structure that as a shareholder loan, which, given a lot of the structures of different private equity funds, as long as it comes out within a certain time period, say 18 months, it can be recycled without any disincentive to the fund putting that capital in. So that's definitely how, over time, I've changed the approach to capital raising for these different projects.
Great. So I want to pick up on something you said in terms of moving on from one financial advisor to another, and particularly for those of you in the room that are in the process or looking to finance a cable. I mean, what are you looking for in terms of a financial advisor for a submarine cable, which is also a good transition to our next speakers? But I mean, what kind of characteristics, what kind of attributes, should we be looking at if we're hiring a financial advisor in this space?
Well, there's not a lot that have experience in this space. There's less than a handful, I would say, of advisors that would advise on raising the equity. So there's a limited number of people, and to the extent that they have done it previously, I think is extremely important, because if nothing else, they're going to take you to the same set of investors that have seen other deals that they've done, some precedent transactions, and to that extent, at least in my specific instance, that was a tremendous benefit going to pitch a deal to someone who had previously met and had seen a successful project come to fruition. So not only as the project developer, but also from a financial advisor perspective, they're only going to take on deals that they think they can get done. So they select you as much as you're selecting them. And to that extent, they're also showing you to people that are familiar with the space and have some level of comfort in that advisor to some extent.
Great. Well, thanks for that, and thanks for the helpful transition to Bertrand. So, and then obviously I'm going to move to Emma. So, Bertrand, from a financier's perspective, can you describe some of the submarine systems you've financed, including the one on your left? And what are generally the biggest hurdles for you, and maybe more importantly, your investment committee, to become comfortable with an investment in the submarine cable space?
Sure, thank you, Andrew. Well, first of all, one comment about this subsector is that it takes a lot of time to sign NDA in this industry, and it takes 1 minute to forget about the NDA. People talk a lot in your subsector. So I will not comment on all the cables we have financed. Larry obviously mentioned our role. I think there was also a press release about Quintillion, about Hawaii Key. There are others, but I will not detail them. They are all different. They are all serving different routes. They have all different business model. But our approach looking at the financing of those cables is not only getting the financing done, because more and more you have multiple pockets of capital, depending how resistant the developer is to be diluted, to get the project done. Our objective is to maximize the return for the cable owner. We are a commercial bank. This is our objective. Obviously, when we lend money is to return the capital we have invested, which is a bit different from multilateral, but it is, at the end of the day, the same objective, getting the deal down with different tools. So ECA worked once on a very ambitious project, because also there was a B-end in Brazil. You would never have an ECA financing between France and UK. Actually, do you really need a cable between France and UK? Junior capital is available, equity is available, vendor financing is available. It really all depends on how to use the tool wisely to cover certain risk and to maximize the return for the developer. But that's super simple. Huh? It's boring, that's banking.
So, I mean, I've seen the Texas in the last few conferences, and not necessarily all your peers. I mean, what is it about the submarine cable sector that's attracting you and your bank to this, sector?
Actually, that's a bit scary, Andrew, because for 4 years in a row, we are the only commercial bank present in this conference. and I can add another one happening in February, and that's quite risky. I can tell you that there are other investors that are clearly looking at that, whether they are commercial bank or junior lender or equity players. Obviously, we came much after, especially in this region, multilateral, World Bank, IFC, ADB, and others that are looking at different systems and are extremely useful for connecting countries or islands where, for us, it doesn't make sense commercially and certainly riskier to return our money. Our objective is to reduce the cost of financing. Maybe that's not other people's objective. I don't know. We are typically at Natixis viewing subsea cable as an infrastructure. And as an international European bank being regulated, this definition of infrastructure is very strict. It has to respect BIS rule number 219 and 221. In order to get access to cheaper money, we need to have visibility on cash flow. We need to have security on asset. Otherwise, it doesn't work. We would need to put much more capital in reserve, and therefore the cost of financing increases.
Well, we're glad you're here. Emma, you're playing a very unique role at the Asia Development Bank. I mean, particularly since we're sitting here in Singapore, and we've talked yesterday about a number of systems and maybe coordinated systems in some of the Pacific Isles. So can you share with us what you and the Asian Development Bank have done over the last few years in terms of some of the submarine cable systems you've financed, and what have been some of the biggest hurdles and impediments for you and your investment committee to overcome?
Thanks for that. Yeah, we've been working with small Pacific countries by and large amongst our 40-odd borrowing members. They're the ones who are approaching us for support for submarine cable projects. What we're seeing is these countries have got very high-cost internet. Governments see the development benefits in pushing that cost down so that they can provide public services, health, education, etc. So we engage in discussion with the governments, who then look at taking out loans or even grants depending on their debt sustainability status from us, and we will actually help them through the process of pulling the project together. That includes thinking about who the cable should connect to. Our first cable project was in Tonga back in 2012, I think, connecting through to Fiji, where they had a big international hub. So we've started from that, which was basically a country building its own cable, through to others like, for example, Palau, where they were intending with their neighbours Micronesia to build a cable through to Guam, but the SEA US cable happened to be being built at a convenient time, and they managed to connect onto that. So we look at whichever option works best for the country, but our real objective is in pushing the price of internet access down as low as we can possibly get it in these countries. So we're not looking for the return on equity, so to speak. And we're looking at there being sort of a pass-through mechanism to ensure that the savings are passed on to the final customers. But in terms of what we look at, we still have to look at the same things as everybody else, because we need these to be sustainable over the life of the cable. We'll put in money up front, but we need to be confident that those managing the cable can pay the operation and maintenance each year. So it's the same things. The demand for capacity, the price that they can charge, the revenue they'll get, those sorts of things, exactly the same things that we're looking at. We just look to finance things slightly differently and slightly different priorities in that.
So how does the Asian Development Bank work with other commercial banks and other private equity funds? I mean, how does those pieces come together?
Okay, so we will try to bring relevant stakeholders around the table. The case of the Samoa, Fiji, Tui Samoa cable that is under construction at the moment, that brought in some local private equity into the cable, both in the form of telecom companies and pension funds. Those sorts of entities in the domestic economy are interested in investing. As yet, we haven't brought in any commercial bank financing. There was a project that we started to develop that did not push through, where we were looking to bring in some commercial debt into the financial arrangements, but that didn't push through. But we're certainly open to that, basically whatever's needed.
Great. So, Yves, go ahead.
Yeah, Andy, thank you. I have a question for the investment banks. When do you expect, as a development bank, to get your money back?
As a development bank, we lend to the government, so we basically have a sovereign guarantee on any lending, so we will always get the money back. What we want to make sure is that government's getting value for money out of the investment being made with that. So we would look to ensure a sustainable sort of cash flow over the life of the project.
So you're more bringing your cash. Okay.
Yep.
And for you?
Great. So actually, let me stick, Emma, with you for
It's a question about tenor, and well, first of all, we need our money back. It's not a grant; it's clearly a loan when we lend money. Well, there are two ways answering that. It could be long or short, but very transparent with you. This kind of asset is fantastic because the construction period is relatively short. You have a lot of risk at CIF that totally disappear at RFS due to the nature of IRU contracts, etc. So this is an ideal asset to be refinanced very shortly after RFS because there is no ramp-up period in this asset. It's operational from day one. You have lots of contracted cash flow. Actually, equity may have returned its money 6 months after being operational, hopefully, and therefore you can extend and transform the capital structure after RFS.
Sure, Larry, go ahead.
So, by the way, just to add to that, so because we're on the borrower side, right, as the project company. So one of the things, the piece parts around this, I think, sometimes are not necessarily well understood, given that it's sort of a new phenomenon, some of these types of project financings of submarine cables. But some of the benefits are, we would say, from a lender standpoint, the moment we closed on our full project funding, which was almost 2 years ago now, I suppose, at that point we had fully achieved our sales target. So if you look at what the institutional equity commitment is into the project, and you look at the sales target from the creditworthy anchor tenant customers, from a lender standpoint, the project is de-risked, right? So it's a given that price goes down on the route because we, and others are introducing new systems that overlap with the older cables on the route, typically. So you do expect a step change in the pricing on the route, which obviously is good for the local economies on each end. It's good for introducing more competition. It's good for meeting affordable broadband penetration objectives of national broadband plans. All of that is true, but from a debt standpoint, the debt's covered, right? It can create uncertainty, further uncertainty perhaps for the equity return, but the asset is secure, the network is secure. Added to that, the benefits to the anchor tenant customers on the project would be that, unlike in a consortium build where everyone is paying during the build, none of the anchor tenants in a project like ours, at least, pay a penny until the system goes live. Nothing, right? And so they take no execution risk. They take no construction risk. They take no budget risk. Because all of that risk falls on the developers and owners of the cable and the equity that stands behind that project. So there are benefits to an approach like that. Like I said, it doesn't work for every route, it doesn't work for every project, but those are some of the examples that were certainly relevant to our project.
I understand. I mean, let me pick up, if I can, on Larry's comment. I mean, obviously, pre-committed capacity, from well-heeled customers, is the gorilla in the room in terms of, what you're looking at in terms of financing. But what are some of the other key factors, that you're looking at the Asia Development Bank beside, customers in terms of, helping an initial raise or a second stage funding, other than pre-commitments from anchor tenants?
Yeah, we're certainly looking at the price impact that it will have. That's quite a major deciding factor to go into a project investment with us. We're also looking for the interests of government to take on board use of the internet for government services. Range of factors really around the development issues. We'll certainly do financial assessment of the project, but we also do a broader economic assessment of the social benefits of the project.
Great. Bertrand, you're sitting in front of your investment committee, for a cable. And, clearly, they're going to look at Larry's point in terms of the number of pre-committed customers. But, what are the other, gotchas? What are the other areas that they're really concerned about in terms of, going ahead with the financing?
You mean except how much money we are making? No. I think that Natixis is quite unique in that sector because, to my knowledge, we are the only commercial bank having a specific lending policy related to subsea cable. Jean-Pierre Jérémy here drafted that 5 or 6 years ago, and I don't think I've seen any other bank having that. We have also a specific lending policy for data center. So there are a certain set of factors that we are checking. Some are technical, some are commercial, some are the robustness of the route, etc. And we never go alone on a project. I mean, having a bank like us or a multilateral is quite expensive in terms of consultant. I'm not talking about financial advisor because there is nobody else better than a bank to do a financial model or to look at numbers, and we can do that. It's not so sophisticated work. It's really the trust we have in the technical advisor. And it takes years to be comfortable with such and such. And it takes 1 minute to be uncomfortable and blacklist one. Commercial advisor as well. There are not so many in your industry. There were many traffic advisors in Australia providing a road forecast before they all went bankrupt, but there are not so many, and they have been relatively stable. There are 2 or 3 very great companies. Work a lot with Michael and with Alan on those ones. And they have proven over time that they were relatively consistent into their forecast. So it's really the overall business model. There are certain documentation points, having sales target, etc., to have the lender comfortable. But more importantly, because you don't lend money 100, 200, 300 million into a project just to put it in default. I mean, the minute you are drawn, you are on the hook. And the worst thing we want to have is to have access to a piece of fiber that is partially under the sea because we don't know what to do with that. And clearly, we are not experienced people to sell the capacity, operate that. It's really being comfortable with the overall sector, and we have internal experts, internal knowledge, credit committee knowledge over time, and doing a lot of financing of data center helps as well because your assets are connecting those assets too.
That's a very interesting point, and I think probably more so than other infrastructure, even more so than other telecom infrastructure projects. The technical advisor here is, a really key player. So,
and I forgot one point that is important for you, at least, and for me as well, is permitting. Permitting is the worst opaque part of the due diligence for us. We understand a bit technically how it works, but the team telecom process, we need to rely on you and other potentially. And it's really important when we look at over 2 decades of the cable industry, some very large system in the Pacific had a very long delay due to permitting.
well, you made my day. Go ahead, Larry.
Just to add on to what Bertrand said, and I think it goes back to the point about how and why you pick a particular financial advisor as well, and I think same thing on legal advice as well. for these projects is if you looked at any other infrastructure asset class in the world, if you were building a new office building in Singapore, for example, and you said, I need to draw on my full financing to build the office building, but I don't have a building permit yet. I haven't done a site survey yet. I haven't done all that. You'd never get that funding, right? But what's one of the many unique things about submarine cable financings is we don't get Team Telecom approval before we get the financing. We get it afterwards. We don't get FCC approval before. We get it afterwards. Same thing in every other country in the world. And so you need advisors around the table who actually understand that, and more importantly, understand what risks and mitigation strategies there are around it, both legal advisors and financial advisors, to help guide you through that process, but more importantly, help guide the institutional equity that's looking to do the project to make sure they understand they should be comfortable with this, and that that's a unique aspect of what we do.
Well, Mike, if I can just jump, you've seen this. I mean, sure, it's great to have good legal advisors, good technical advisors, but don't you have to be the orchestra leader? I mean, don't you need to translate that, to the equity participants, to the debt participants? Aren't they looking to you to, juggle all those pieces?
Absolutely, and you're the benefactor of it, so it's up to you to really champion that. But I think it's very, there's a learning curve definitely in terms of looking at things that are important, and different people and different investors focus on different aspects of the project. The regulatory and permitting is a great example whereby some people see it as the same risk as a pipeline, despite the fact that it's very benign in nature. So in many instances, the permitting is not the same sort of risk that an investor would typically think it might otherwise be. And so you definitely have to spend a lot of time in order to go and get the investor over a lot of hurdles. And it can be frustrating at times because in many instances where I would see the risk in a project differs from where a potential investor would see risk. And I think at some point, let me put it this way, the market has seen a lot of deals happen, and they're becoming more educated. There's a lot of precedent transactions that have happened. You've seen Seabourn happen, Hawaii Key, Aquacoms, Hibernia Express. So that pool of investors that are seeing these deals now are becoming more educated themselves, which I definitely think helps to get over a lot of the due diligence issues that come up that aren't really pertinent to the success of the project.
Go ahead, Yves.
Yeah, one thing which should be mentioned and reminded is that there is no ideal model of financing, of course, because each cable, and this was said by Larry, each cable is unique, is very complex, and it has many challenges to be solved, and they are always very different depending on the region of the world. A submarine cable has also a very high geopolitical impact and interest from many people. And so this is why I think all what we hear now is that there are many models who can work. There is no unique model, and this is a good part of it. But you have to take care at the same time. You have to involve many people around you, right? So that everyone is sure that all the different challenges have been addressed, and the money can come in the more secure way. If you don't do that, first you don't do your job correctly, and you start to take risks which are unmeasured, and which is the worst to do for submarine cable.
So in that regard, now that we finished building Brazil to New York, we've announced that we're in the process of building from Brazil to Argentina, and we will soon be building Brazil to Cape Town, South Africa. And to Yves' point, the financing strategies for those other two projects are totally different for us. The irony is that when you talk to institutional equity about our sector, a lot of the times the institutional equity players just lump it all in together. you know, in the early days of Seaborn, Bertrand and I would sometimes hear from, let's say, a big insurance company, oh, I know your industry because I looked at a Trans-Pacific project in 2002. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, any other industry, if you said, I looked at something that was in a different part of the world and it was more than 10 years ago, it's a totally different project, different market, different competitors, et cetera. But because our industry is unique and poorly understood, sometimes the equity players don't appreciate the distinctions that Yves was just mentioning.
And maybe just to add to that, I think in the instance of Hibernia being acquired by GTT, that is really helpful to the other private cable developers because it had a nice multiple attached to it of about 8.5 times EBITDA, and that definitely shows other investors that they can actually exit an investment and make money doing so. And because there's not a lot of there's not a lot of private subsea projects that are acquired, I think that, you know, that acquisition is really a benchmark that helps institutional equity investors take a look at their IRR when they're looking at an investment.
Well, great. I told the panelists that the panel would go by very quickly. I didn't realize how quickly, since we're almost out of time. Could I just ask really quickly, Emma, starting with you, final comment on what's going to be new in the future in submarine cable financing? What are we going to be talking about next year that we're not talking about today?
Certainly from my perspective, we're looking at doing more complex financing, more financing partners involved. The Manitoba cable probably is the most complex one we've done in the Pacific, but I can see there's potential to do bigger, more complicated projects than that.
Great. Mike?
I think some of the thresholds that you will need to do on the sales side are actually going to go down just because there is a lot more capital that is a bit looser in going into the industry. And I think the impact will be that you've had to have a very de-risked project to get financed over the last 5 years. And I think that's going to get a bit easier.
Okay, speaking for ACE, I think the challenge is to go further than what you have done. That is, we are the first cable, I think, where some landlocked countries have a direct access to a cable station. They own a bit of a cable station in a country which is not their own, right? I think it's the first. And I think we are trying to give the connectivity to more landlocked countries in Africa through the cable.
So on the seaborne side, I think for us, we've tried to position the company as very much a platform play and a repeatable model. And so we're looking at a lot of different opportunities right now in other parts of the world where we can wrap around the capabilities that we bring to bear on aspiring new individuals and entities that are looking for new builds and leverage the platform that we've built. Because I think part of the challenges that people like Mike and I faced in the early stages was that there was, after the telecom crash, a long period of certain failed private cable efforts, and everyone got sort of tainted by that, and there was an assumption for a period of time that any private cable announcement was destined to fail. And I think that's changed when you see what Hawaii has done, what Aquacomms has done, what Mike has done on a number of projects, and what Seaborn has done. I think the view is changed, but nonetheless, starting as individuals, it's high-risk development capital, it's long lead times. So if we can play a role as sort of a turnkey developer, owner, operator and wrap around others on their projects and improve the execution rate and the speed of execution for them, I think that's certainly something we're looking to do.
Well, great. Great the aspirin's working and the hangover's over. Okay, Burton, final word.
Thank you. I think that 3 things. First of all, the current status is that it has never been as easy to finance a subsea cable, and very cheap as well, because we have a multitude of tools available, tested over the past few years, and liquidity becomes adequate for those assets. The forecast for the future is certainly the emergence of 2, 3, 4 regional or global player, carrier-neutral player like Larry, having a platform of some cable, not recreating the bubble in 2000, connecting all the dots, but some cable operator that are only doing that in certain underserved market. With cable number 2, 3, 4 coming, this is what I wish for you. And my hope for the future is that cable developer come earlier to see us. We are not there to help them raising the first few millions. It's not our role as a bank. We are not a VC, not a seed investor. But coming to see us, they can clearly use individual or small consultant to help them. But in order to avoid difficult situation and some poison pill that we need to tweak at the time of the big round B and C financing.
Great, very uplifting. Well, tremendous conversation, and I'll hand it back in a minute to Regina and Michael, but please join me with a big round of applause for what I thought was an excellent panel.
Thanks, Andy. If I could ask everyone to stay in place, Regina says that we have time for one question, so make it count if there's anyone in the audience who has a question for the distinguished panel. Anyone? I'm sorry? Well, you've covered all the topics then. Thank you very much. Another round of applause for Andy and the distinguished panel. Thank you.